This is the Sustainable Goat Podcast.
We look to nature for how we should interrelate to the world. All the answers are within nature if we take the time to listen.
But what we have to find is a reasonable way how to handle plastic.
You know, consumers expect more. They're expecting brands to be more sustainable. They're choosing sustainable brands.
These are the stories and ideas from those that will define a generation. I'm your host, Steve Cassinem, and this is our planet in focus. Dude, how are you? How's the week going?
Pretty good. A lot of rain. I love the rain for our environment, not for my feet.
I grew up in Santa Cruz and my parents were up in Santa Cruz this past week and they were just sending pictures of just getting pounded with rain. And I was like, this is like not normal.
It snowed.
Yeah, on the beach.
I mean, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's completely wild. So it's been an adventure. And in Colorado even, I was just talking to somebody and they said it's the coldest winter in 30 years here. And I can confirm it's freezing cold here. Like brutal. I mean, I've been here like 7 years and it's definitely a cold one. Coldest one I've ever experienced.
I love the disconnect though, because then I'll hear comments from people who are like, oh, and people are talking about global warming. And you're like, wow, okay, let's unpack that. Let's unpack that for a minute.
Right. And I have a buddy of mine on the East Coast who he's like, he lives in New York in Brooklyn. And he's like, yeah, it hasn't snowed all year. He's like, I've been wearing short sleeve shirts most of February. And I was like, what? It's crazy.
That's ridiculous.
So I figured we can just start to dive in, and I'd love to start with just a bit about where your passion for sustainability actually came from. Where did your fascination start with it?
My mother is incredibly creative. My mom's an artist and an art teacher, and my father is one of the wisest people I know. First off, he's the smartest person I know. It's very difficult. He always gets the answer correct. And to my chagrin, I'd want to tell him, no, you're wrong, but I know he's right. So I grew up with like a very powerful home life and family. And my mom's creativity, I think, was what really started me thinking about the world. And I think my dad's compassion really pushed me in that regard as well. My father was a leadership and development coach, and before that was a lawyer. And we are definitely a family that prioritizes lifelong learning and the concept that we can constantly learn and do and pursue. And I just grew up with a mom who, like, we would take out PVC pipes and start making structures with them. My mom collected wine corks and did a massive project with it one year, took basically plastic bags and used an iron to iron them down into these little squares and made these art pieces out of them for auction to raise money. So all these things came together with, I think, growing up in the Bay. I mean, I grew up in Marin County, and it's like the world around you. I look up at the hills that are right next to my house and I'm like, wow, it just looks like a painting. It's hard for me to fully grasp the beauty often because it's like profound.
What do you think is so important about maintaining that curiosity about the world? Because I think from just not only an informational standpoint, but a creative standpoint, a development standpoint, the curiosity is key to kind of being able to look at problems, solve problems, and also connect with others. I mean, do you think that kind of influenced to where you are today?
100%. I think that curiosity is more than looking at others. I think it's about looking at yourself. And I think that sustainability is a lot about internal knowledge. I think that it's about separating your identity from things. I think it's focusing on the internal world and understanding like your own relationship with the world around you. I think that's been a big part of my journey. I think a big part of my journey has been time in nature and understanding how do I feel when I'm like just surrounded by the natural world and my relationship to it. And it's like the feeling of joy that I get when I'm like, I don't know, on a hike and I'm able to look out at a beautiful view. We have a waterfall near where I live, and going up to it every single time, there's just like this feeling inside that's hard to describe. But without having the internal knowledge to be able to feel and desire that feeling, we fill that void with things. And I think that's a lot of the consumerism and what I would say unsustainable practices of today come from.
I think that's such an interesting point because, I mean, you and I were both lucky in the sense that we were able to grow up, with access to nature and beautiful nature at that. But also you have that educational piece side of really what nature can bring for you. I mean, we had a podcast where talking about just being surrounded by nature, even if you're inside, relaxes the subconscious. And so when you start to kind of look at how to apply that feeling that you get in nature and you start to look at the problems that we face as a planet, where did you kind of see that bridge being able to be built?
I think it began by looking at where do I think the problem is? And I think that the problem is that we are both more connected and more disconnected than ever. I mean, I think that technology has given us the ability to instantly learn, to instantly communicate, and to instantly receive gratification. And it's also made us isolated. It's made us isolated because we're not having authentic conversations and we're not focused on understanding one another. And I think the bridge with sustainability is focusing on where do we come together? Where are we alike? And how can we focus on those elements rather than what makes us different? Right now, I think that there's a culture that's prioritizing what makes us different and creating very strict barriers and identities. And I think that we need to have a fluid state of being that leaves ideology at the door, because at the end of the day, we only have one planet and we all share it. So no matter what background we come to the world with, we're all members of the same global order.
I love the way you put that because, I think our mission at GOAT is really to show the human side of all of this and the idea that humans drive this. They drive the impact on an individual level, on a group level. And yeah, it's how do you connect with the other human across the table? How do you connect with another human and see that, hey, we're all kind of in this together? And I think one of the big challenges is that people don't really know where to go. Like there's no place to kind of know that you can gather that knowledge or be able to connect with those humans. And we're all kind of siloed, almost, I want to say intentionally, but I think it takes a certain level of awareness to kind of say, hey, like, let's look at these problems from a different angle and how interconnected it is. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me right now is the idea of biomimicry. In technology and in the product space, you see a lot of this. How do we learn from nature and how nature interacts? And how can we replicate that in something that we use every single day as a product? Well, if you take that biomimicry and you then put it to human nature, nature supports different species. It supports different self. It's a very complicated system. And we're also a part of that system. And where do we fall in that, I think, has been part of my fascination is how can we learn to live a little bit more balanced like nature can?
I love what you're doing with GOAT. And I think that it directly resonates with what I want to be doing in the world. And I think the narratives that I'm focused on are the next generation. I think that millennials and Gen Z are more diverse than any generation before. And they're also the most interested in sustainability. And we talked about this on our last call, but what I find really confusing is the fact that sustainability as a field, as a part of our system, and the way that we are doing business is focused on basically, I would say, like 50 plus people who are institutional investors, people who have the time and have the desire to go and read, say, a 200-page ESG report. It's not focused on those who want to be empowered, and I think who feel depressed because they're not empowered. And back to what you said, they don't have a place, an identity, or any sort of symbol that is telling them, hey, there are people that care about what you care about. And I think that without that, we're leaving a lot of people behind in a mission and movement that needs to be everyone. And I think that's a real big concern.
Yeah. And if you kind of look at, I mean, you're at UCLA right now, and the college system is, to me, it's an excellent opportunity because you have a gathering of people that are there to learn. They're there to learn something. They're there to build community. The idea of a college is you have a collegial environment. And where kind of you fit into that system in trying to build that community specifically around sustainability at UCLA?
I think it all began with My first quarter on campus, I was like, okay, what do I want to do? And I was like, okay, I really want to develop diverse relationships. I think my entire life I've been surrounded by basically people just like me. And part of that was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to get involved with student government. And I went and served on our resident government council. And while I was doing that, I would hear people talk about all their problems. They would come and tell us like what was wrong basically at the UC. And a lot of it was about sustainability. It'd be like, wow, we're throwing out so much food in dining. Our composts are overflowing with trash. People would share all these things that were causing them real concern. And I started to go investigate them. And the one that was most easy to investigate was dining. I started to go to dinner later and I saw that dining at the end of the night was going and taking their leftover pans and often just like tossing it in the garbage. And I was like, oh my God, this is so upsetting. We must be wasting so much food. And albeit we are wasting a lot of food, but I talked to the heads of the dining program and they were like, Isaac, how many of those trays do you think we're putting out a night? And I began to think about it and I was like, wow, okay, so let's say they're putting out 300 trays, 1,000 trays, 2,000 trays, whatever it is, they're throwing out less than one. And that's when I began to see that the problem was actually, again, more with the people who were using the system than the system. And what I mean by that is the problem is not the production side waste, but actually the dining side waste. Students are taking too much food, and that is where the problem was occurring. And so I realized that there is this uncomfortable disconnect between, I'd say, I don't know if it's administration, if it's leadership, but intergenerational disconnect where we have older people in authority and leadership positions and younger people who are the stakeholders in those systems. And the young people don't feel like the older people have their interests in mind. And I think because of that, fight the system. And that fighting is just really not helping us pursue a sustainable world, which is actually the goal all of us have. That's what really inspired me to go after creating some sort of club, a Club Zero, that is creating that space and that type of narrative that brings together this intergenerational movement that is working together to empower the next generation and place them more inside of the direct narrative of the places they are stakeholders.
I think that what's really important about that too, of that intergenerational movement, is I think that disconnect, everybody wants the same thing at the end of the day. I mean, I think, from an older generation standpoint, they have children, they have grandkids, and they're saying, look, I want to improve this world and make it a little bit better. And I want my grandchildren to thrive, but they don't necessarily know what that disconnect is between them. And I think one of my favorite stories, a little bit more into the technology history, but when the Mac first came out with a mouse, Steve Jobs had this party, and you had Yoko Ono and Andy Warhol, and it was just like this big party. And he watched this child use paint and started to paint with a mouse. And Andy Warhol tried to do the same thing, famous artist. And he thought it was horrible. It wasn't a paintbrush. And one of the messages that came out of it that Steve Jobs said was that, well, if you give something to a child, watch them interact with it, that's how you know it's a good product. And when I think about that interaction, there's such a wisdom in the younger generation. There's an open-mindedness. There's a way to see the world differently that hasn't been shaped by either experience in the business world or what they were told by the next generation above them necessarily. There's this willingness to try something different. And I think at this point, we're kind of at that point where we should be trying something different, because in the world of sustainability, it's kind of an open field at this point. We don't really know necessarily what the best solution is because we haven't been able to test it over a long enough period of time. And so my question would be, in Club Zero, what's kind of your goal in really bridging that gap?
Yeah. First of all, I think that's a great story. I hadn't heard that story about Steve Jobs. And I think, it's always, even for me now, I'll see little kids interacting with iPads or different devices. And I'm like, oh my God, like the way that we orient ourselves to the world is just so different. Every different generation to your question, before addressing what my goal is with Club Zero, I think it's important to focus on what you said about like what is my generation being empowered to do. And I think my generation is being empowered to horizontally innovate. And what I mean by that is to improve what is existing. But I think what is existing is causing our problems. And you spoke to this. You spoke to the fact that, hey, like, why would we use the system that has led to these problems to solve the problems? And I think that's one of the big issues. I was asked a question on a scholarship essay, and it said, how can the undergraduate experience best prepare students to participate in our future? And my answer was, it can't best prepare them to. What it needs to be doing is it needs to be empowering them to create that future. Because as you said, we don't know what that future looks like. Club Zero is about changing the narrative. It's about helping people realize that all of us collectively share the same goal. We want to live on this planet and we want to live good lives. We want to live in symbiosis. I don't think people want war. I think that we all want what is sustainable. I think we all would agree that a world that is pursuing sustainable development is powerful. And so I think it's about creating a space that has a diversity of narratives and a diversity of forms of expression and gives the audience the opportunity to actually participate and share their voice. So I think that's not been happening. I think it's been a top down approach and not a bottom up approach. And I think we need to go bottom up and we need to go middle throughout and we need to go top down. We need to be doing everything because this has to be a worldwide pursuit.
I think the interesting point in there is really when you're younger, you have this willingness to try something and you generally thrive and or learn that lesson by giving it a shot and failing. And I think sometimes, you know, when you start tackling big problems such as sustainability, there's a fear around being wrong. If you steer it the wrong direction, you're making the problem worse. But in reality, nobody knows what the right direction is. And I think that part of solving these problems is really giving people a platform where they don't have to fear that they're wrong, that any solution could be a solution. And we're giving everybody a very inclusive experience for everybody, a diverse approach to solving these problems in a way where the willingness to try is there. Because that excitement, that creativity, that buildup of like, you really can change the world. I think that's where those ideas come from.
You just completely spoke to what I hope Club Zero is. I mean, right now, we all are working for a sustainable world. And the question is, how can we make sure that everyone feels like that? I think that everyone in just pursuing being a better person on a daily basis, improving who you are, improving the way that you study, improving every single aspect of being can be put in terms of sustainability, and that can begin to normalize what I think of is seen as an out there type of topic. I think it's an orbit and that we can ground it in daily life.
From your perspective, where you're at and the people that you're in school with, where do you find that most progress can be made? Because you may not be able to have this huge business that can suddenly change, but where can you foster those ideas? Where do you see the change starting to happen? Because I think you have this balance between, you know, the consumer mindset of how you shift your consumer decisions, but you also have, you know, it's at a pivotal age where you're shaping the next generation of careers. And so where do you find that most important thing is that can drive change at the collegiate level?
I think at the collegiate level, it's about realizing that you have the power. Like the students are the ones that make up the university. And at the end of the day, the university is here to cultivate students. And so I think that coming together and kind of demanding change is powerful. And I think that coming together, not only demanding change, but asking to be part of that change is even more powerful. It's about really the work of advocacy and unity. That's what needs to be done. I think where are people at? I think we're not there. Right now, people, again, are siloed. People are focused on what do I find important? And if that's not about nature or waste, I think people don't see what they are doing as sustainable and focused. But I would say that focusing on things like zero poverty, focusing on things like zero hunger, those are all within the realm of sustainability because this is global. I mean, we're going to see the population rise. We're seeing globalization at a rapid pace, and we need to create a narrative of globalization that is about how can we prioritize sustainability in our own lives and the systems that we use.
What do you think some of those systems can be? Because I mean, obviously, like, I think right now, specifically from the consumer side, most, quote unquote, sustainable options, right? If you wanted to have the better product that was made the best that it could be, zero waste, it might not be in the price point of somebody that is in college. So do you think that it's kind of on that responsibility of the younger generation to either have patience to be able to buy the right thing and not buy the quick impulse thing? Is it on the business side to provide better solutions for that generation that fit that price point as best as possible? Or is it really just figuring out where the middle is and maybe trying another solution such as composting or something like that, that might be a little bit easier barrier to entry?
This is part of what I'm trying to address with Club Zero. And I think the answer is complex. I don't think you can tell students that they should be the ones spending more money to live sustainably. I think that's what they should be doing. But I think that is a privileged type of mindset and one that's not going to catalyze change. I think what is needed is that brands and our consumer system has to be prioritizing the focus of the next generation such that they can then make the choice that is better for them. What I mean by that is right now, I think no matter like, let's take the sustainable option. How do you know that's the sustainable option? There's this distrust because I think that Gen Z doesn't see themselves in the brands. I don't think that there is a brand that is correctly articulating, hey, I care about how you care about improving the world. That's what I want to be doing. I want to have a system that goes to businesses and says, hey, I want to tell you how you can align yourself with the next generation. The goal is again about setting goals that are achievable and push the envelope. We can't demand that things just shift overnight. Having ambitions for things like zero carbon and zero waste are integral. But right now, we just don't have the tools necessarily to get there. In the interim, it has to be, hey, I'm hearing what you are demanding. I'm hearing that you feel that we need to be giving back more to the community. And here is what I'm going to do about it. There's this big disconnect in terms of what organizations think is corporate social responsibility and what Gen Z and millennials think is corporate social responsibility. So you have all these dollars going, what I would say, not to waste. I think that they're being used on effective and helpful programs, but they're not catalyzing investment from the people who want to be invested in building that better world and voting with their dollars.
You hit on a really good point there because I think a lot of businesses are striving to change. And even just regardless of the younger generation, I even think just the general public doesn't understand that it's not a switch. When you have these massive supply chains or you have these massive businesses, it's not necessarily their willingness to change. It's very difficult to change a business when it's that big. That's one piece of disconnect for sure. But the other side too, and that you hit that nail right on the head, is there isn't that connection between a business and Gen Z. There's not that feeling that that brand was built for me. And you think about some of the most successful businesses of the last 10 years, and if you were to take just even the technology sector, right? That sector was built mainly by like fresh college students, college dropouts who then said, hey, we're going to write some code and we're going to change the world. And the whole world got behind it because they connected with that generation. Like when I think about things from a marketing perspective, it's much harder to grab an audience when your entire audience is in a career sense But when you watch to see how something gets popular on a college campus, if it's a good idea and people are all about it, it spreads like wildfire. It's crazy. And it's like, how do you build these systems to where that, to me, is the best way to generate change, is to do it from the younger side, because that's, you get an access to a community that they kind of trust each other because they're in that community together.
100%. And I think what you hit there also speaks to the fact that Gen Z is still at an age where they are spending significant time with their parents. I think that once you enter the workforce, you're going home less often. So if you are younger and you are passionate about something, you then go home and you interact with your parents, and then your parents go and interact with their friends. And there's this compounding of impact. That is how we create change. And the example would be, if we can get Gen Z to see themselves in sustainable products, in companies that are actually walking the talk, then they will get behind it. They want to get behind it, but they don't know what to be getting behind, because companies don't know how to interface with this generation. And that's what I'm providing. I'm interfacing with this generation and telling you, this is what you need to be doing, because this is what people care about. And then when you get people to care about it, and when you get people to feel that good feeling from doing good, all of a sudden they're invested in it. Now it's not a more expensive product. It's a completely different product, because you're getting that internal validation that you are helping make change, because you are.
And from the Club Zero standpoint, you guys have quite a few initiatives kind of going on. What are some of the ones that you're kind of working on right now that will kind of engage that community?
The first one is directly the B2B aspect. I think that there, again, is not a certification that is like, hey, I'm going to go to Gen Z, I'm going to talk to them, I'm going to go and interface with them, and I'm going to see, what do they know about the organization in question, the business in question? What do they think about what it's doing in terms of sustainability? And then go back to that university or that company and say, this is what your consumer thinks about you. How can we shift to get them to X, which is what you want them to see you as? So I think that's about involving them in the evolution of business and the evolution of how we are doing business as a global order.
What I find interesting too is that the idea of social entrepreneurship, I think it's a term that's been starting to be used a lot more, but I mean, I first heard about it probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And it's one of those things that it was kind of like, well, I don't know if it's going to work. It kind of seems like it might be a trend. And it's like, no, the next generation want to support businesses that stand for something, that have beliefs, that have an ethos, that have a different bottom line that benefits, whether it's a community, whether it is sustainability. People want to support brands that actually stand for something more than just selling products.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think that what needs to be integrated right now into brands in order to catalyze this sustainability mindset is, I care about how you care about the world. That's not being told to people who are in their 20s. I think people in their 20s feel that the older generation doesn't care, that their brands don't care, that people don't want to empower them. I think there's this mentality of, I am in a fight against. And that's the furthest from the truth that's possible. All of us, when we sit down and have a frank conversation, would agree and say, I want the world to be here in 50, 100, 200 years. I want people to have more access to ethical jobs and have better wages and all the things that I think are involved in sustainable development. We agree on that, and it's about bridging that gap. Because the second we stop fighting, we come together, we can do basically anything. I think that's what our history shows.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you start looking at these brands that are, shifting their narrative to a more sustainable mindset, they're saying they're working on doing better. Is there like a certain level, I guess, where you as a Gen Z / the people who are around you, is there kind of a litmus test where it's kind of like, ooh, they're the real deal? Or that, ooh, they're just kind of doing this because they're trying to kind of hop on a trend. Is there a line that's kind of easily seen from Gen Z? Because I think in a certain way, the thought is like, well, if we just say it, then people will flock. And if we run the right ads and shoot a good commercial, like it'll make sense.
Yeah. No, I think there isn't the line right now. I think that's part of the big problem. I think that there's so much distrust that people see all these terms and are just like, what does that even mean? What is a B Corp? What does 1% for the planet mean? What does FSC mean? And I think that brands are doing really important, impactful things, but it's not registering with Gen Z. And I think the key one is trees. If you're like, okay, I'm going to plant X number of trees for every certain amount of dollars of profit, that's out of the orbit of, okay, I can see this, I can feel this, I can do this. It has to be from a third party organization like Club Zero that is saying, like, we are Gen Z and we are agreeing that this is a company that is implementing the values and what Gen Z wants. And I think that's a real big disconnect that needs to be solved.
Yeah, I think that connection with what is happening and what is impact is, I think, an important thing just in general in the industry, because I think, you support a brand that says, hey, we plant 10 trees. You don't necessarily know where. You don't know if there's trees actually help. I mean, even in the carbon offset industry, there's a lot of misunderstanding around, like, is it actually offsetting? Like, how is it being measured? And you just have this like almost confusion kind of going on where everybody wants the same thing once again, but like there's a disconnect happening. To me, the way that I always learned the best, I'd be the first to say I didn't really fit into the school system super well, because I always needed to try something. I needed to do something. And the moment I held it, touched it, felt it, interacted with it, I understood it. In the case of sustainability, we don't necessarily see the impact because it might be halfway around the world. So in our own community, we go, well, it's a sunny day, it's good, it's warm, it's cold, but they don't necessarily see what does the other side of the world look like. You have Indonesia who just stopped, all of these different areas are actually changing the way that they're accepting our waste, that they are living their life because they're kind of saying enough's enough because we have a problem on our hands. And I think the kind of seeing is believing concept, I think kind of needs to be a little bit more brought to the forefront in sustainability, because I think everybody remembers during the pandemic when everything shut down in India for a little bit and people could see the mountains. It went viral because people could see the A and the B. And I think that might be part of it, to where people aren't seeing the A and the B.
Yeah. And I think more than that, people aren't seeing themselves within the community. They're not seeing themselves within the narrative of sustainability. There's not a central location that is like, hey, I am here for everyone. I'm here for whatever your vision is for a better world. I'm here for a net zero world that is addressing sustainable development, that is including you and bringing you in. And I think one of the powerful things that can help with that is art. We all have so many different forms of expression and ways of connecting. And back to what you said about school, we now live in a time where people agree, there's so many different methods of learning, whether that's auditory, visual, experience-based. We need to be bringing all those narratives together and focusing on, hey, what if we listen and empower the next generation to be sharing those narratives with each other? Because that's what my generation has been good at. I mean, back to your point about social media coming up from like young folk are constantly seeking community, and providing that community is so integral. And that's what Club Zero is here to do. It's here to amplify your voice, create unity, and really allow you to feel like, wow, like someone actually cares about what I care about. Someone is actually here to help me with that journey.
Do you think there's something also to the actual human connection? And totally correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I kind of believe that there's a shift away from just being digital all the time and kind of going back to the one-on-one human connection, like see someone's face, have a conversation with them, don't necessarily have it be through a phone. Do you see that starting to shift, or is that still kind of the way?
It's a mixed bag. I think we are moving towards that. And I think that's where we need to go. But I think it's also hard. Going back to what you were talking about how the world is shifting. I mean, like what Indonesia was like, we're not going to export palm oil because, you're giving us all of this crap basically for the fact that we are doing unethical things, but you're the ones who are pushing it. You're the ones who keep on buying it. And the difference is, what do you do? How do you, here in the United States, as a consumer, try to interact with, okay, I'm buying this chocolate bar that has cocoa that's been sourced from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. How do I understand where it was exported, who was doing the packaging, who was doing the producing? We can't necessarily bring together people in person, but I think that with technology, we can bridge a lot of those gaps, and then we can begin to catalyze those conversations that happen amongst peers. I mean, people are having dinners together. What are they talking about? Why aren't they talking about that? Why aren't they talking about, I just read the most impactful story about a former shrimp farmer from Thailand and his escape and what he's doing. Like, that's a narrative that people want to hear, and they want to hear it and they want to share it. And by sharing it, I think it brings attention to the problem, and it gets people thinking about the problem, and it gets people innovating. And that process of innovation, of conversation, and normalization is so integral to the immediacy of what we need to be doing. We need to be acting now. And the only way we can act is if we're having conversations with each other.
Yeah. And I mean, whether it's digital or not, one of the things that I've always believed in is that when you get human brains in a room, there's something magical that happens when you have an open opportunity for people to creatively bring their ideas without criticism in a totally open way. That's where you get somewhere. When you have an idea and then you build on it, I mean, that's how things come to life. It's that refinement and all the different views of all the people that are involved. And that's one of the reasons why I think that one of the most important things that we need to do as a society is really accept diverse mindsets into solving this problem, because the way that I see the world is different from the way that you see the world. And what's crazy is we grew up an hour from each other. So what is it like when someone is 3,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away, halfway around the world on an island? What are the struggles that they have? I mean, Thailand just stopped accepting plastic anymore. What's that going to look like? Where is all that going to go? When you're able to get those human experiences from the shrimp farmer or somebody halfway around the world, I think that changes perspective in a way that can not only open minds, but possibly create better solutions.
And that's why I'm honestly so focused on universities and colleges with Club Zero. Colleges and universities are places of diverse, both demographics and thought and socioeconomics. I mean, everything. On a single university campus, you have so many different stories that are all there. What happens when you go to the people who are those students and you're like, hey, what do you want to see changed? When you go and you take those ideas and you go and bridge the gap by putting them into the image and the idea of what the institution they're attending is, I think that begins to rapidly make profound impact. People don't see themselves in their universities. And I think that we're not correctly using the diversity of opinions that we have on a college campus. I'll just sit down next to someone randomly on the bench and I'll start talking to them. And they're from somewhere around the world. The stories I hear from international students have opened my eyes beyond anything that I would have expected. And I'm not traveling to that country. I'm just talking to a person who lives 15 feet away from me in a different apartment building.
But they grew up with a completely different experience. I mean, what are some of those communities that you've been kind of getting involved more with and learning their stories that have kind of helped you shape where you want to drive Club Zero?
I think the communities that I've been looking to for Club Zero are seeing UCLA has a beekeeping club, and going to the beekeeping club and seeing the passion that people have about, like, we need to save the bees. And I'm like, I 100% agree. Like, this is such a problem. Our entire agricultural system depends on these mighty animals, and we're not focused on how can we protect them. And seeing that, or then going to a different club called Sage, and they're doing work particularly with policy and government advocacy and helping tell students, like, call your mayor, call your representative, like, your vote matters. They want to know what you care about. Start talking to them. And then going to an entirely different group and hearing, this is what I'm doing to end food waste. And right there across these three different groups, these three different groups are tackling an area of sustainability entirely differently. And I'm like, oh my God, what happens if we can bring them all together and empower them all and make them feel less isolated? I think all these groups feel relatively alone. It's such an uphill battle when you feel like, wow, it is me fighting for X. And I think the narrative is it is us working towards Y. That's what we need to be feeling. And that's what is real. It's about shifting the way that we relate to those around us and to the institutions that house us, such that we can feel that everybody's kind of in alignment. So at the end of the day, whatever you're doing to improve the world and to make our world more sustainable, you're working to make the world more sustainable. It's that simple.
It's really cool just because when you look at it from just even, the communities of food and beekeeping, well, both of those kind of rely on one another. A lot of produce needs bees to pollinate. And so you just have this interconnected system that rely on each other. And I think, again, going back to learning from nature, that's how nature does it. It's a balance and it's a community. And my idea for Sustainable Goat one day is to, have all of the key players in the entire space from all different diverse backgrounds, from all different areas of the world, sit around a table and have a dinner and then just watch what happens in the world. Because I think you're right in the sense that it almost feels like you're alone in this type of journey, because oftentimes, what you're focused on, you're so laser focused on, but there are so many other ways that it overlaps into other things and can help other people that once those doors are open, that's when the real stuff starts to happen. And then you're able to bring your expertise to the table. I'm able to bring my expertise to the table. And then really amazing things happen from that. And then I think the biggest benefit is that something that you and I could do, or something that you and somebody else could do, could inspire somebody who's maybe 9 years old. And what could that look like when they get to college, when they start to look at how they want to shape the world? I think there's just this trickle-down effect that I think happens when people are brave enough to say, look, I think we need to do something. And they're willing to open up the doors, be transparent about it, and say, let's do it.
I love that you brought up just like dinners and dinner conversations. I didn't realize until I was older that it was weird that I grew up in a family where we always ate family dinners. Every single dinner we had as a family. My parents didn't even cook that much. Most of it was very simple meals, like a big salad and pasta. But we would sit together and we would talk and we would have interesting conversations. And I think going about sustainability right now, you're not going to see people sitting down at dinner and talking about it because it's not fun and it feels depressing. So I think the question is, how can you get those college students to be sitting at a dining hall, sitting across from each other and going back and forth and having this dialogue that's passionate, that's excited, and that's really focused on what can we do? Because that's what we need to be doing.
Well, and I think so much of the sustainability narrative is based on this almost like forced responsibility that we all have to do something, or that there's guilt, or that it's doom and gloom that, we're coming to the end, by 2040, what's going to happen? By 2050, what's going to happen? And I think instead, it should be shifted to, by 2040, what can we do? By 2050, what can we do? Because even just that subtle shift, now suddenly there's opportunity. It's not out of a fight or flight necessity, world ending, let's, leave the earth kind of thing. It's no, this is an opportunity where we have a period of time where we can generate some massive change. And I also think part of it is looking long term. I think some of the short term results, one of my favorite examples right now is the fact that, yes, we are all talking about plastic and the problem that plastic does have, which is obviously entirely true. But what I find fascinating is everybody says, well, what about glass? But if you look back in history, everything was done in glass. Milk was delivered in glass. I mean, we're almost going back. And if we look back at our history, there's lessons to be learned along the way. The only reason why plastic kind of took over is because it was very convenient. at the time. And at that time, it actually was kind of the best decision. We just didn't know that at the consumption rate that it has such an impact. And now that it has such an impact, it's like, oh man, well, maybe we should reevaluate. How can we start to build these systems with a long-term mindset of thinking, okay, before we embark on this journey, what is it going to look like in possibly 20 years to the best of our knowledge, instead of what's going to be the Band-Aid fix in 3 years?
Yeah, that's a really powerful question. And I think focusing on also just the radical ability we have to innovate is so important. I think having a growth mindset here is incredibly important, because I think that we are going to have a lot of setbacks, and we do have a lot of setbacks. Going back to the earlier thing you brought up, the example would be in terms of the carbon markets and the voluntary carbon market. And I would say, there's a lot of confusion with the voluntary carbon market and whether or not it's able to help make a change. But I think it does. And then you look at something, though, for example, like a large forest fire. A large forest fire can set back the carbon sequestration of a forest in such a massive magnitude. So I think the question becomes, what is happening? What radical inventions are being made around me? What radical choices is someone else making that I can look at and see? Because when you look at those and you begin to de-radicalize it, essentially, that becomes a normalization, and that becomes something that all of a sudden everybody can get behind. Like the other day, I met a student who's working on creating cement that would sequester carbon. And I'm like, that is so incredibly cool. Why can't we be talking about that? The news that you see around campus is, here's X or Y problem. It's not like, here is what X student is doing. And there needs to be that. I think that we need to be focusing on what is going right so that people can do more of it. I think that focusing on, hey, like there is this urgency and things are going wrong. I think that's 100% true. There is a sense of urgency and things are going wrong. But if we just say, hey, there's a sense of urgency, things are going wrong, we're not getting anywhere. And I hope that Club Zero will be the space that's like, hey, there's a sense of urgency. Things are going wrong, but here's what we plan to do about it.
Yeah. And I think when you start to look at how, systems are set up from technology companies, from how good products are built, right? A lot of that comes from the concept of removing friction. How do you make it as seamless as possible? So if you want to buy a vehicle or buy any type of product nowadays, the discussion is, how do you make it so that the consumer can do it in the least amount of friction as possible? To me, I don't understand why we're not copy and pasting that model essentially into the understanding and the solutions around sustainability. I think removing the friction, whereas does a person have to understand the issue on a deeper level? Do they have to read the ESG reports? Absolutely not. However, if they want to, go for it. But if they don't, what's the simple thing that they can not even spend a lot of their brain power on to make a better decision? And I think that the friction side of things is something that I don't think has been solved yet.
Yeah, you're right. I think there is a lot of friction. And I think that it's about simplifying it. I think it's about simplifying ESG into a way that's understandable. I think it's about simplifying what you're doing into things that are easily understood, and just making the simple statement of like publicly saying, I care about the world.
So what is kind of your goal in 2 to 3, maybe 4 or 5 years? Where do you want Club Zero to be? Is it every single university? Is it every single business is a member of Club Zero to a certain extent? Is it consumers? Where do you want to drive this in the long term?
I think it starts with the university system. Universities are such a place of diversity and knowledge, and Gen Z is the stakeholder in the university ecosystem. But where do I want it to be in 5 years? In 5 years, I want it to be really in the hearts and souls of those members of the movement. I want it to be something that you can wear, something that you can look to and say, this is a group that cares about me and is giving me the tools to help create a net zero future. That's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is instilling a sense of pride in being a member of a global community, pursuing a net zero future today, not tomorrow, but doing it right now.
Where's your favorite place on earth to enjoy nature?
100% Point Reyes. Point Reyes, that's like a magical space. Being able to be in the redwoods, being able to just look up at these massive trees that I think are such a testament to wisdom and the power of nature. I don't know how you can't walk into a redwood grove and feel like you're surrounded by these ancient, I would not say people, but these ancient living, I'd say creature almost. I think that the trees that are there just speak to me of the endurance that we see around us in nature. And when you were talking about, like we can look to nature for so much, and I'm like, look at these trees, these plants that have survived for literally hundreds of years. Like they have seen so much go on, and yet they've sustained and they've grown throughout the entire process. And I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to be focused on, how can we constantly stretch towards the sunlight and dig our roots ever deeper. I think that we have so much to learn from trees in particular. And then also just the beach. I mean, looking at water and being able to hear the noise of creatures and feel the sand is such like a integral experience to who I am and how I view our world. Marine ecosystems are really magical, and that for anybody who doesn't think of themselves as in sustainability, they've not spent enough time on the coasts. I think that there's so much beauty on the coasts, so much unique ecosystems that all you have to do is spend a little time in them, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is what I'm working to protect. This is what I'm working to maintain.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. I mean, for me, it's definitely, the ocean. A specific beach that I went to when I was younger and still go to when I can and when I visit California is definitely, for me, that's my favorite place. But, I grew up across the street from a redwood forest, and I think you're so right in that sense of, I don't think you can really explain that feeling that you get when you first kind of stand next to these massive, massive trees. And the idea that I remember in elementary school, I was taught that they grow in rings, the redwoods, because they're families and they support each other. The roots support each other in the wind, in the weather, and that you have this natural system that you can learn so much from. And I was just finishing John Steinbeck. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the author of Mice and Men, super famous in like the California coast because he kind of grew up there. But I just finished reading a book of his, and and this was like 1950s, talked about going into the redwoods and the feeling that you get of the redwoods. And he was like, I hope that everybody can get this feeling because there's something special about it. And I just found that humbling that no matter how much time passes or how many different things that happen in the world, those trees are still there. And hopefully they will still continue to be there, but they have seen so many things and probably learned so many lessons that I think we can kind of learn from them a little bit.
And I think it speaks to the entire conversation we've had about this intergenerational narrative. It's the fact that no matter who you are, what time you are in, going up and standing next to a redwood it's like a profound experience. And I think that connecting with nature is as simple as going up to that tree and giving it a hug. Like if you wrap your arms around that bark and you just look straight up, I don't know how that could be anything other than a profound experience. If you go to a beach and you look at the waves rolling in and rolling back and you sit there and you just listen to it and you're like, what is this? What is the water? What is beneath my feet? What is causing all of this? Like there's this profound sense of awe. And at least for me, whenever I return to the redwoods or to the beach, I feel like a kid because I don't think I will ever understand it. There's something there that's just so profound. And I think beyond science, like we can look to science to explain it all, but I think there are things that we just like intimately feel at a spiritual level in nature. And I think that we can learn a lot from our indigenous communities about that, about protecting these sacred locations and really understanding that nature is sacred.
Well, and I think you're spot on that about the ocean and feeling that sense of awe. Because I mean, you sit on the beach and there's, living in Colorado now, I don't have access to the ocean quite the same. And I kind of miss that sound from time to time. And, you can put on really good headphones and listen to ocean sounds and stuff. But every time that happens, it's never the same, because there's some sort of thing that happens when you're sitting there that you can't replicate anywhere else. There's a sound, there's a depth, and there's a feeling that you get when you're actually present with it or can feel it and hear the ocean in a real way versus afterwards. And that disconnect, even just for me trying to search for that replacement sound, if you will, even if you take the most high quality recording, there's still something missing. And that to me was just the easiest lesson in that there's a bridge in nature that we can't replicate besides being in it and protecting it. And so that part has always been a passion for me. How can people kind of get involved with you, with Club Zero, connect, join the movement, learn more about how you're kind of going about everything?
Google us, find us online, and just join the movement. Look at what we're posting and see if it's for you. And then I think about nature, go out and experience it. That's what you were just saying about oceans. If you live near one, go grab a tent and sleep on the beach. It'll be probably the best experience of your life. Like the best sleeps I've ever had are bike touring along California's coast and ending a day and just hearing the waves. That noise just lulls me to bed. Like it's immediate.
Yeah, you biked the coast of California. So tell me about that trip.
Yeah, my dad has been a bike tour since he was really young, like 12. He biked from San Francisco to a state park called Samuel P. Taylor. And he really pushed me to do that as well. And all my best memories with my father are us biking. When I was 13, we biked from Portland to Eugene. And I got to go through these like massive farms and see miles of vineyards. And that was such an experience. And then as I grew, we just kept on doing different rides. And biking on the coast was just magical. I mean, being able to be that close to the water and yet being able to see the diversity that is along our coast. I mean, like literally every mile is entirely different from the mile beforehand. At every single point, there are different trees, there are different communities. The people that you meet on the road are just, it's hard to describe. It's a magical experience.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, Isaac, thank you so much for just taking the time, and really thank you for inspiring the next generation. And as being part of the next generation, thanks for honestly having the courage to kind of step forward and say, look, I'm going to stand for something. I'm going to do something about it, and I'm going to grow a community around it. Because I kind of believe that for movements to really happen, regardless of, a quote unquote leader, it's almost like a flash mob. You need somebody to just start doing it. And for people to see like, hey, this is going to be a positive experience and people want to join in. So I just want to thank you for taking the time and really building something that I think is really going to change the world.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for what you're doing with the GOAT. I love listening to the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Sustainable Goat podcast. I'm your host, Steve Castanham. With each episode, we can further define what it means to create a truly sustainable and resilient future.
I think the new status is to show that you actually care. You want to drive change and you want to be part of a sustainable future.
People fight for what they love.
Let's really all target for a small but significant shift in the way we live, we consume, and we plan our life.
Join us at sustainablegoat.com.